It's hard to imagine what a woman of the 1800s would say if they had a chance to speak with the women of today. I have no doubt that the women in Wisconsin who emerged from within the Ceresco Union would have more than just a few words to say. However, truth be told, very few women actually used their voices back then, mostly for fear or judgment from the many men surrounding them. As Ripon began consuming the utopian leftovers of Ceresco from 1851 through 1855, we exposed the horrible nature of the Wisconsin Phalanx doctrines to be judged from the following brief synopsis. First, the right of every woman to choose who shall perform the part of a husband for the time, and to change that person as often as she pleases. Second, the duty of a woman to yield herself to the embraces of the man she loves. Third, that these principles, when put in practice, will bring about the millennium, will do away with the pains of childbearing, and alleviate human suffering in various ways. Fourth, that fornication may be holy. Fifth, that bigamy is no crime. Sixth, that the crime of adultery is fictitious, and that what the law calls adultery may be the highest and truest relation of which two persons are capable. Seventh, that bastards are the most beautiful children in the world. Eighth, that society ought to be destroyed. Ninth, last and not least, that wives, though idolized by their husbands and supported in affluence, are to yield to the love of other men if they like them better. Needless to say, all the gatherers of the March 20th, 1854 Little White Schoolhouse meeting were all residents of a growing community that was exploding hotbed of experimental radical ideas. Now, there are conflicting reports to exactly how many were in attendance in the one-room schoolhouse that evening. The littlewhiteschoolhouse.com on the main page states a small group of Ripon citizens. Then, on the history page, dozens of Ripon residents, and it highlights 5 men named to the new committee and displays a roster that has a list of 11 men. However, source accounts and congressional record determines it was 50 men, 3 women, and 1 child present that night. We know the history boasts the key names of men like Alvin Beauvais, who came to Ceresco drawn to the Phalanx philosophies, and who carried the call and chaired the schoolhouse meeting, resulting in the named party, Republican. Yet we still felt compelled to know, who were these women? Why were these 3 mysterious female figures lurking in the shadows of the candlelit room that night? Being recorded in history only as individual, nameless numbers. Until now. The Ripon Rabbit Hole has learned they were not in the room that night to cook, clean, or watch the child. These women were there in force for the sole purpose not to be forgotten in the creation of a new party that, if considering abolition, women's rights, such as suffrage, ought to be included as well, and they meant business. We have reason to believe that the women in the schoolhouse meeting that night were named Mrs. Chamberlain and Miss Bassett, who were eager participants there on the invite and encouragement of spokesperson and then new to the area, Mrs. Nancy R. Allen. Born and raised Nancy Rosina Mason in Essex County, New York, she grew up quickly after her mother had passed away when she was only 3 years old. In 1848, at age 18, 6 years before moving to Ripon, she was resilient, self-reliant, intelligent, and fashionable, embracing key political concepts of abolition, health reform, and women's suffrage. Joining the Women's Rights Party and assisting in its growth as a young woman on July 10th, just days before its official announcement and convention call held in nearby Seneca Falls, July 19th through the 20th. She was a little fish in a big pond, then surrounded by the likes of Elizabeth C. Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, historically some of the most influential women in the emerging movement. Soon after, in December of that year, she married J.W. Allen, whose paternal relative was Ethan Allen, a famous Revolutionary War hero and founder of the state of Vermont. She would spend the next 5 years being educated in her cause with the movement and was witness to the birth and took part in activities of the Jackson Sanatorium, a Dansville, New York institute that became known as our home on the hillside and attained a national reputation of the water cure, or hydropathy, a popular mid-19th century alternative medicine. Originating in Germany, it was based on the belief that pure water was the key to good health and long life. The sanitarium thrived. It was the epicenter of women's rights, health, and dress reform, drawing many popular icons such as Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, and Clara Barton, founder of the Red Cross, as well as Amelia Bloomer. Women of the movement wore bloomer costumes, gowns with very wide sleeves and puffy loose-fitting pants. Although widely associated with women's rights, bloomers were actually one of the treatment outfits for those taking a water cure, and it was believed that tight women's clothing caused most health problems. The wet dress was introduced at the Danville-Jackson Sanitarium to women's rights leader Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and it came to be dubbed bloomers for Amelia Bloomer's advocacy of women. In 1853, Nancy packed up her American costumes and moved with her husband to a Ripon farm near Arcade Acres. She quickly became an outspoken mouthpiece for her friends back east, as well as the local women of Ripon. One can only imagine the sight and fright of the men in the schoolhouse meeting that night as Mrs. Allen showed up in her bloomer costume, sleeves rolled back and ready to fight. Her own recollection of the night of March 20th, 1854, describes the very hostility she was up against and reveals an unknown side of Alvin Beauvais not often discussed. She states, "We 3 women took seats in front of the platform. Major Beauvais got up to speak, and looking down at us, he said, 'We're about to build a new house.' Staring directly at us, continued, 'And we don't want any rotten plank in it.' That plank was the provision for the Women's Rights Party." Mrs. Allen recalls, "I looked back at him and wanted to tell him what I thought of him. I didn't. Instead, I just smiled. What self-control." Many viewpoints entered the room and assembled that evening, yet the fact remains they all left united. The party pioneered the right of women to vote and was consistent in its support throughout the long campaign for acceptance. The time has come to recognize Mrs. Nancy R. Allen as an instrumental spark in the flame of freedom. Tune in next week as we discuss more about the momentum that carried forward beyond Mrs. Allen, and we'll also reveal a key figure who was supposed to be in the schoolhouse gathering that night, but was not. Who and the reason why may shock you. To learn more, visit riponrabbithole.com and be sure to subscribe for additional case files.